Jiro here for Umbra Games with a review of Super Dungeon Brothers, or Bros I guess, played on PlayStation 4, but also available on Xbox One and PC. Super Dungeon Bros could best be described as an arcade version of an isometric dungeon crawler, I suppose, but the game also tries to fuel itself on principles presented from the modern version of subgenre, known as roguelikes, but often labeled more closely in the modern console age as roguelites, or procedural death dungeons, like The Binding of Isaac and Enter the Gungeon. Another in a set of indie titles that publishers make the call to produce physical copies of. I also got White Gravy to purchase one and bro up with me via online multiplayer. The story in Super Dungeon Bros, as presented in the game's cutscene, featured every time you launch a game regardless of the map you choose on single player, shows 4 different colored knights, with one opening the door with a vinyl record in hand, placing it on the record player. The narrator then tells these knights that there's adventure out there, and to live on with the spirit of rock. And then you play, or you try to. When you start a game, you choose from one of the 4 characters, differing only in color, and then you choose a weapon. Weapons fall into 4 classes: swords, hammers, crossbows, and wands, and a basic sword and crossbow are the first ones available. Each weapon has a light and heavy attack using R1 or R2, and a special attack triggered with triangle. You get 2 special ability uses per dungeon, but you can spend gold gathered in the dungeon to replenish that. You move with the left stick, and you can choose the direction you wish to attack with the right one, which is especially critical with ranged weapons. You can also perform a dodge roll. Now, enemies assault you in waves, forcing you to be pretty careful with your positioning, and to not get cornered and beaten down, which can happen often. There are about 4 different enemy types unique to each dungeon, and then stronger veteran versions as you work your way to the deeper depths. With the floods that constantly come at you, melee often ends up as just exchanging blows, and the controls aren't quite smooth enough to allow you to roll in and swing and then roll out without taking damage. Nearly every enemy drops a gold coin, which can be used to upgrade your weapons at the end of the depth, giving points to damage, critical hit, or defense. Each weapon has its own set of upgrades. You can use gold in the shops that appear in the middle of nearly every depth to buy full health, an extra super ability use, or an extra life, in addition to the 4 you start with. When all lives are depleted, your adventure ends, and you're taken to the menu screen and you start from scratch. Now, one neat addition to the Rogue-lite formula is the threat meter. As you spend time on each depth, the gauge in the lower right corner will begin to fill, and every time a segment is complete, a wave of enemies will spawn. Once the gauge is all the way full, enemies will just come pouring around every corner and will stop dropping money, driving you to find a good balance of money collection and progress speed. Per the roguelite formula, treasure chests can drop spheres of your character color. These spheres provide buffs that last for the rest of the dungeon. These vary from things like taking no fall damage to the very nearly essential lifesteal on hit. Now, the game's 3 dungeons feature randomly generated maps for the 5 depths you go through to reach the boss on the 6th. Unfortunately, random generation in this case often just includes changing the orientation of that dungeon piece, and since the camera is locked, it gives a slight appearance of difference. There really just aren't that many pieces to keep the variety going in each of the dungeons, so after 1 or 2 playthroughs of each, if not before, the environments begin to feel the same for the entire 45 or so minutes it takes to finish one. Upon defeating the boss and completing the dungeon, you're awarded a vinyl record with a 1% boost to a stat, and you receive some gemstones of various colors. You can save up gemstones to buy new weapons from the Bro Shack to jump in and try again. Now, I didn't see any difficulty settings, but the game does feature braziers at the beginning of each dungeon that you can light for various effects to occur on that run. These include harder mini-bosses, taking more fall damage, or the opposites. The reward or deduction is from points, which I'm not really sure overall what they do for you, except maybe for the leaderboard. The weird thing is, you take plus or minus 200, for example, for making it harder or easier. And if you went through the entire dungeon without touching the braziers to alter it, your final scores are 19,000 some, so does it really make that much of a difference? There is up to 4-player cooperative play, available both online and locally. As I mentioned, White Gravy joined me for some playthroughs, and most of them were just off to a rough start. The first night we played the game, we had full crashes taking us to blue screen. Once I got locked on a loading screen while he was playing through, and he could see my avatar fighting enemies. On another instance, I got stuck on a loading screen again while he was spawned in a pit and he couldn't crawl out, but had him send me a screenshot. At that point, I just closed the application, and for him it displayed a finish screen showing him dozens of kills for each of us, and then he got some random gem rewards after it told him his bro abandoned him. In another instance, I was fighting enemies that he said he couldn't see. One oddity with multiplayer, though, is I found going through on single player I'd end up with 10 to 15 of the aforementioned sphere buffs, where with 2 players we'd end up with maybe 2 to 3 each. Now, I'm guessing this is a attempted balance, with the ability to revive fallen party members in addition to the attack power more characters bring, but I found this game to be so much easier solo. I think this, combined with the dungeon parts changing in multiplayer to require someone to stand on a switch here, or you have to throw your bro around to lower elevators and whatnot, oftentimes you had to throw them off screen to perform said action. It just made the co-op experience a bit more frustrating. The game also suffers from some really bad hitching, pretty much every time enemies spawn through the threat meter, but also at other random times. So, to kind of sum up here, little reward for map completions, only 3 dungeons with no unlockable content, random dungeon generation is built from very limited pieces, the experience is not really altered by the pickups gained on each playthrough, the attempted rock theme that they were trying to drive just doesn't really get displayed, and the flavor text rockers should eat their vegetables and too much cowbell are the driving force of their humor. Crashes and glitches and hitches abound, and online multiplayer was only functional about 50% of the time. Melee often just comes down to blow exchanges. The co-op, quote, puzzle, end quote, navigation is poorly designed. I mean, I'm gonna be honest, this is probably the least solid video game I've played on PlayStation 4 to date. I actually toyed with the idea of not even finishing it and just putting it back on the shelf, and I don't do that. This comes down to just a lot of good ideas on paper that's just very poorly executed. I was hoping for a multiplayer Binding of Isaac, so perhaps high expectations could have contributed to my problem, but I think it's just because this was a nearly unplayable experience. Rated as a action RPG roguelite, Super Dungeon Brothers, after a point reduction for instability, hits a 6 out of 100 with 50 being an average game. This is Jiro for Umbra Games. Thanks for watching. Can't win them all, but feel free to subscribe for new video notifications or follow me on Twitter @Umbra Games.